In the forgotten wetlands of the Louisiana coast, where the cypress trees stand like skeletal sentinels and Spanish moss hangs from gnarled branches like funeral shrouds, lies the decaying ruin of a place once known as the Blackwood Reach. For over a century, its history was buried, its secrets guarded by the marsh and the cloying silence of the Deep South. But in the spring of 2023, a team of surveyors, tasked with mapping the eroding coastline, stumbled upon a truth far more terrifying than any local ghost story. Just beyond the crumbling brick walls of the old sanctuary, they found a field of sunken hollows, and beneath the dark, peaty soil, they discovered the first of what would eventually number 347 unmarked graves. These were not the victims of some long-forgotten fever or a natural disaster. The forensic evidence recently unsealed tells a story of systematic, calculated cruelty. The bones speak of malnutrition, of bizarre and repeated physical trauma, and of medical procedures that belong not in a place of healing, but in a laboratory of horrors. This discovery challenges everything we thought we knew about a celebrated chapter of Louisiana's philanthropic history, for the Blackwood Reach was not merely an asylum or an orphanage. It was the personal fiefdom of the Rathmore family, a name once synonymous with piety and progress. And the recently uncovered journals of its founders reveal a philosophy so twisted, so macabre, it redefines the very concept of evil. They never burned their witches in Blackwood Reach. They had something far, far worse in store for them. What happened within those walls is one of the great, suppressed atrocities in American history, a story of absolute power wielded in the shadows. And it is a story that the powerful forces of the past have tried very hard to keep buried. But some truths, like the bodies at Blackwood Reach, refuse to stay submerged forever. This channel is not for everyone. We delve into the darkest chapters of history, into the stories that lie gathering dust in sealed archives and forgotten footnotes. If you are one of the brave souls who believes that the truth, no matter how unsettling, must be brought into the light, then you have found your community. We ask that you subscribe and join our fellowship of truth seekers. And to mark your place in our growing assembly, comment below with the name of your city or country, a small testament to the fact that the light of inquiry shines brightly all across the world. The story of the Rathmore family begins not in the humid darkness of the Louisiana swamp, but in the cold, righteous austerity of late 19th century New England. It was an era of stark contrasts, of burgeoning industrial wealth pressed against a backdrop of rigid, almost medieval piety. Into this world was born Alastair Rathmore, a man who seemed destined for the pulpit. He was the charismatic leader, the public face of the enterprise that would one day curdle into a monument of depravity. From his earliest days, Alastair possessed a preternatural gift for oratory. His voice, a resonant baritone, could fill a cathedral, but it was his eyes that truly captivated his flock. They were a piercing, crystalline blue, and they held a gaze that was at once beatific and predatory. He spoke of a new kind of salvation, a practical faith that did not merely content itself with saving souls in the hereafter, but sought to perfect the vessel of the Spirit in the here and now. His sermons were legendary, blending scripture with the burgeoning language of science and social progress, a cocktail that proved intoxicating to the wealthy industrialists and anxious socialites of Boston and Providence. They saw in him a modern prophet, a man who could navigate the turbulent waters of a changing world without losing the anchor of faith. But Alastair's vision was not his alone. It was a trinity of ambition, a family bound by blood and a shared, secret ideology. The second pillar of this triumvirate was his sister, Dr. Eleanor Rathmore, the methodical specialist. While Alastair charmed the public, Eleanor worked in the quiet solitude of the laboratory and the lecture hall. She was one of the first women to graduate from a prestigious medical school, a feat that lent the family an air of progressive brilliance. She was a physician, a chemist, and a student of the burgeoning and often ruthless field of eugenics. Her public writings spoke of improving the human condition, of eradicating the scourges of poverty, disease, and mental defect through enlightened science and compassionate care. She was precise, detached, her mind a razor-sharp instrument. Her letters from the time, however, reveal a chillingly different perspective. In one, to a colleague in Germany, she writes, "The common man speaks of the soul as a thing of ephemeral, divine fancy. I have come to see it as a simple biological equation, a chemical reaction that can be balanced, purified, and, if necessary, neutralized. We must not be afraid to trim the blighted branches from the great tree of humanity." Here, in her own hand, is the cold arithmetic that would later guide her work at Blackwood Reach. The third and final member of the founding Rathmores was the practical enforcer, the manager of the coming nightmare, Silas Rathmore, their younger brother. Silas had none of Alastair's charm or Eleanor's intellect. He was a large, brutish man, grounded and ruthless. He had failed in business and in the military, finding his true calling only in the shadow of his accomplished siblings. Silas was the one who handled the logistics, the finances, the dirty work that kept the family's public image pristine. He was the one who could make problems and people disappear. Together, they were a formidable force, a corrupt collective masquerading as a holy trinity of faith, science, and industry. They envisioned a new kind of institution, a sanctuary far from the prying eyes of the northern establishment, where their radical theories could be put into practice. They sought a place where the vulnerable and the unwanted, the blighted branches of society, could be gathered under their absolute control. Their gazes turned south towards a vast, untamed Louisiana coastline, a land of immense beauty and profound isolation. They purchased a huge tract of land, a former indigo plantation left to ruin after the Civil War, a place the locals already regarded with a superstitious dread. They called it the Blackwood Reach, a name that was both poetic and prophetic. They presented it to the world as a revolutionary endeavor, a place where orphans, unwed mothers, the mentally frail, and the destitute could find refuge and purpose. Donations poured in from their wealthy northern patrons, who were enchanted by the vision of a southern Eden, a testament to their own enlightened charity. The Rathmores were building more than a sanctuary. They were building a laboratory, a fortress, and a tomb, all disguised as an act of grace. The very architecture of the place was a form of foreshadowing. From a distance, the main building, constructed with dark, locally fired bricks, had the soaring lines of a cathedral. But up close, its features became unsettling. The windows were too narrow, more like arrow slits in a medieval keep. The walls were unervingly thick, and the whole compound was enclosed by a high brick wall topped with iron spikes, a feature Silas insisted was necessary to protect the residents from the dangers of the swamp. But the gates, as it would turn out, were designed not to keep dangers out, but to keep the vulnerable in. The first residents arrived in the winter of 1898, a train car full of orphans from the grim workhouses of New York, their passage paid for by a philanthropic society that had been utterly captivated by Father Alastair's sermons. They were the first test subjects, the first souls to be delivered into the Rathmores' insular kingdom. They were met on the newly built platform by Father Alastair himself, his arms outstretched, his blue eyes shining with what they must have mistaken for kindness. Behind him stood Dr. Eleanor, her expression neutral, clinical, as she assessed the new arrivals, her gaze lingering on the frail and the fearful. And lurking in the background, almost hidden in the shadows of the station house, was Silas, his presence a silent, brooding promise of order and discipline. As the children stepped off the train into the humid, alien air of the Louisiana coast, they had no way of knowing they were stepping out of history itself, their stories about to be consumed by the grand, monstrous experiment of the Blackwood Reach. The early years of the Blackwood Reach were, by all public accounts, a resounding success. Father Alastair Rathmore was a master of public relations, carefully crafting a narrative of redemption and renewal that he fed to the newspapers and his network of wealthy donors back in the North. Illustrated pamphlets were printed, showcasing smiling children in clean uniforms, tending gardens, and learning trades. They depicted a pastoral paradise, a self-sufficient community thriving under the benevolent guidance of its visionary founders. These publications spoke of moral hygiene and spiritual fortitude, concepts that resonated deeply with the anxieties of the Gilded Age. The genius of the Rathmores' deception was its appeal to the era's obsession with progress and control. They were not merely warehousing the poor, they were, in Alastair's soaring rhetoric, sculpting new citizens for a new century. He would often travel, leaving the day-to-day operations to his siblings, and his fundraising tours were theatrical triumphs. He would bring with him a hand-picked child, a model resident, who would stand on stage, scrubbed and polished, and recite a prepared speech about their salvation from the gutter. These performances were devastatingly effective, loosening the purse strings of families whose fortunes were built on the very industrial squalor from which these children had been rescued. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, a very different reality was taking shape. The true nature of Blackwood Reach was rooted in a perverted ideology that the Rathmores had developed in private, a doctrine they referred to in their journals as the purification. It was a grim fusion of Alastair's heretical theology, Eleanor's radical eugenics, and Silas's brutish pragmatism. They believed that society's ills, poverty, crime, mental illness, and moral deviance, were not social problems but spiritual impurities, hereditary stains on the soul that could be identified and, more importantly, isolated. They saw themselves not as saviors, but as divine arbiters, tasked with separating the clean from the unclean. And in the isolated kingdom of Blackwood Reach, their definitions of purity and impurity were absolute and unquestionable. The residents, a growing population of orphans, unwed mothers, immigrants who spoke no English, and people committed by their families for melancholia or hysteria, were the subjects of this grand, terrifying experiment. They were the vulnerable, chosen specifically because they had no social power, no one to speak for them, no one who would notice if they simply vanished from the face of the earth. Their lives within the walls were governed by a rigid, all-encompassing system of observation and control. Upon arrival, each resident was stripped of their name and assigned number. They were then subjected to an exhaustive examination by Dr. Eleanor Rathmore. This was the first sign of the true horror that lay beneath the surface. Her examinations were not meant to diagnose illness, but to categorize souls. In her private ledgers, discovered a century later in a lead-lined box beneath the floorboards of her laboratory, she catalogued her patients according to a disturbing set of criteria. She noted physical defects, measured skulls with calipers in the grotesque practice of phrenology, and developed a series of psychological tests designed to reveal moral weakness or spiritual contagion. Her notes are a chilling testament to her detachment. One entry reads, Subject 74, female, age 17. Admitted for promiscuous tendencies. Cranial structure suggests a predisposition to deceit. Eyes are shifty, evasive. Low forehead indicative of limited moral reasoning. Prognosis, contagion level high. Recommend immediate isolation and commencement of the primary ablution. The primary ablution was not a baptism, but the beginning of a systematic process of dehumanization. Residents were divided into castes based on Eleanor's assessments. The potentials, those deemed salvageable, were put to work in the laundries, the kitchens, and the fields, their labor funding the entire operation. They were subjected to Father Alastair's daily sermons, hours of indoctrination designed to break their will and remold their identities. His words, which sounded like grace from afar, were a tool of psychological torment up close, filled with condemnations of their inherent worthlessness and the promise of a painful, arduous path to purity. The second caste, the incurables, were those Eleanor had judged to be beyond saving. These were the residents with physical disabilities, those who displayed defiance, or those simply deemed genetically unfit. They were relegated to the most grueling labor and housed in a separate, fortified wing of the main building known simply as the West Ward. The West Ward was a place of shadows and silence, its existence hidden from all visitors and omitted from every glossy pamphlet. It was here that the Rathmores' experiment entered its darkest phase. The practical management of this brutal system fell to Silas. He was the warden, the enforcer, the one who ensured the smooth, quiet operation of the machine. He employed a cadre of guards, men much like himself, who were loyal to the family and shared their contempt for the residents. Discipline was swift and merciless. Infractions, from speaking out of turn to failing to meet a work quota, were met with punishments that were both cruel and bizarrely ritualistic. The solitude cells were not merely isolation rooms, but lightless, soundproofed voids where a person could be left for days. The penance diet, as described in recovered documents, was a near-starvation regimen of bread and water, often laced with powerful sedatives of Eleanor's own devising. Silas was the ever-present threat, his heavy footsteps in the hallways a constant reminder of the consequences of disobedience. He was the fist to Alastair's velvet voice and Eleanor's cold intellect. It was this perfect, monstrous synergy between the three siblings that allowed Blackwood Reach to function. Alastair provided the divine justification and the money. Eleanor provided the pseudoscientific rationale and the methods of classification and control. Silas provided the muscle and the fear. Together, they had created a closed system, a self-perpetuating cycle of exploitation and abuse, all under the banner of Christian charity. For years, this system ran with terrifying efficiency. The disappearances, when they began, were subtle. An incurable might be transferred to the West Ward, and then weeks later it would be quietly announced that they had succumbed to a sudden illness or had been transferred to a specialized facility upstate. No one could question these claims. The residents were cut off from the outside world, their mail was censored, and any attempt to escape was met with the full brutal force of Silas's authority. The swamp itself was a powerful accomplice, a natural prison of venomous snakes, alligators, and disorienting, trackless mires. The local community, a sparse collection of fishermen and trappers, kept their distance, intimidated by the wealth of the Rathmores and unnerved by the unnatural silence that surrounded the walled compound. The first crack in this perfect fortress of cruelty, the first sign of the true depravity of the Rathmores' purification, would not come from an outside investigation or a heroic escape. It would come from within, an inciting incident born of a simple, human desire for a truth that the Rathmores were determined to keep buried at any cost. A young woman, given the number 117, began to ask questions about her missing friend, and in doing so, she would unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would eventually expose the full, macabre history of the Blackwood Reach. The inciting incident, the small stone that would start the avalanche, began with a woman named Elodie, designated by Dr. Eleanor as Subject 117. Elodie had been committed to Blackwood Reach by her family after giving birth to a child out of wedlock, a common offense that filled the institutions of the era. She was quiet, observant, and had been categorized by Eleanor as a potential, her transgression deemed one of passion rather than inherent corruption. She worked in the vast steam-filled laundry, a place of grueling labor and hushed conversations. It was there she formed a close bond with another young woman, Anya, Subject 204. Anya was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, sent to Blackwood Reach from a charity house in New York. She spoke little English and was deeply distrustful of authority, traits that quickly earned her Eleanor's negative assessment. She was deemed an incurable, and despite being physically strong, was marked in Eleanor's ledger with a chilling annotation: contumacious spirit, resists moral instruction, genetic lineage suggests peasant stock stubbornness, a poor vessel for the Lord's light. Despite the risks, Elodie and Anya found solace in their shared plight. They would communicate in whispers over the hiss of the industrial presses, sharing stories of their former lives, their hopes, their fears. Anya, haunted by the folklore of her homeland, would speak of the dark woods and the creatures that lurked within them, drawing unsettling parallels to the ever-watchful Silas and the unnatural order of the Reach. One Tuesday, Anya did not appear for her work shift in the laundry. This was not unusual. Residents were often reassigned without notice. But when days turned into a week, Elodie's anxiety grew. She began to ask questions, a deeply dangerous act in a place where curiosity was treated as a symptom of rebellion. Her inquiries were met with a series of chillingly evasive answers. A guard told her Anya had been moved to the kitchens. The kitchen matron said she'd been assigned to field work. The field overseer claimed she'd been confined to the infirmary for a fever. The lies were clumsy, contradictory, and they did not soothe Elodie's fear. They sharpened it into a certainty that something was terribly wrong. Her persistence eventually drew the attention of the Rathmores themselves. She was summoned one evening to Father Alastair's office, a place designed to intimidate. It was paneled in dark cypress wood, the walls lined with leather-bound books that no resident was ever permitted to read. A single, large window looked out over the darkening swamp. Alastair sat behind a massive desk, his face a mask of paternal concern. "My dear child," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "I understand you have been troubled. It is a heavy burden you carry, but you must place your faith in our judgment. Anya, subject 204, was very ill. Her spirit was afflicted with a contagion that Dr. Rathmore and I worked tirelessly to cleanse. But her vessel was too weak. She has passed on to the Lord's keeping. We should not mourn, but rejoice that her suffering is at an end." The explanation was meant to be final, a divine edict. But Elodie saw something flicker in his beatific blue eyes, not pity, but a cold, hard annoyance. She knew he was lying. The true turning point, however, came not from Alastair's hollow words, but from a small, seemingly insignificant object. A few days later, while sorting a new batch of laundry taken from the West Ward, the forbidden wing where the incurables were housed, Elodie's hand closed around something hard in the pocket of a rough-spun shift. It was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, something Anya had shown her weeks before, a trinket she had whittled in secret, a memento from her father. The shift it was in was stained with a dark, rust-colored substance, and a chemical smell that clung to the fabric, a smell Elodie recognized from the infirmary. Anya had not been sick. She had been taken to the West Ward, and she had not come back. That small bird was a message from the lost, and it transformed Elodie's fear into a quiet, burning resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She became the first uncoverer of truth. She knew she could not fight the Rathmores head-on. She had to be smarter, more observant, more patient than them. She began a secret, one-woman investigation. She feigned compliance, becoming a model resident, earning a measure of trust from the lower-level staff. She volunteered for the most unpleasant tasks, any job that would allow her to move through different parts of the compound. She collected whispers, glances, and fragments of conversation. She learned to read the patterns of the place, the deliveries of strange chemicals to Eleanor's laboratory in the dead of night, the way Silas would select certain residents from the evening muster, the hushed-up accidents in the workshops. Her most terrifying discovery came when she was assigned to help clear out a disused storage cellar beneath the kitchens. In a dark corner, behind a stack of rotting crates, she found a pile of small personal effects, a worn-out doll, a tarnished locket, a book of Russian poetry, and a dozen other items she recognized as belonging to residents who had succumbed to illness or been transferred away. It was a hidden trove of confiscated memories, a graveyard of identities. This was the Rathmores' method. They did not just dispose of the body, they erased the person. This secret collection of artifacts was the first physical evidence of a systematic pattern of disappearance. Elodie began to document her findings. Lacking paper and pen, she devised a system. Using a stolen needle, she would prick tiny, coded patterns into the hems of her uniform, a secret ledger of the lost. Each cluster of pinpricks represented a missing person, the date they were taken, and any detail she had managed to glean. It was a desperate, dangerous act. If discovered, it would mean more than just a punishment cell. She knew, with chilling certainty, it would mean a final visit to the West Ward. The gradual escalation of the crimes was something Elodie witnessed with growing horror. The disappearances became more frequent. The criteria for being labeled an incurable became broader. It was no longer just about defiance or disability. A woman who rejected Father Alastair's increasingly inappropriate spiritual counsel, a man who showed too much intellectual curiosity, anyone who reminded the Rathmores of a world beyond their control, all could find themselves on Eleanor's list. The purification was accelerating, becoming more brazen within the sealed walls of the Reach. The true purpose of the West Ward was the dark heart of the mystery. Elodie knew that it was not just a place of confinement. The chemical smells, the strange, humming sounds of machinery at night, and the exhausted, haunted look of the few attendants allowed to work there all pointed to something more sinister. It was Dr. Eleanor's domain, her laboratory of the soul. The full, horrifying nature of her work there was still a secret, but Elodie could feel its shadow lengthening over everyone in Blackwood Reach. She knew she could not stay. Her time was running out. Every day she remained. She risked becoming just another pinprick pattern on a tattered hem. Her focus shifted from investigation to escape. But escaping Blackwood Reach was thought to be impossible. The walls, the guards, the swamp, it was a fortress designed for absolute containment. Yet in her quiet, desperate search, Elodie began to find its weaknesses, the small cracks in the Rathmores' perfect system of control, born of their own arrogance and their deep underestimation of the resilience of the human spirit. She had the evidence, however cryptic, and she had the will. Now, she just needed a way out. The midpoint of our story marks a descent into the true abyss of the Rathmores' depravity. What began as a system of control and exploitation was mutating into something far more monstrous. The mask of benevolent social engineering was beginning to rot away, revealing the skull of homicidal ideology beneath. This is where the narrative becomes challenging, a testament to the darkness humans are capable of. We believe it is vital to bear witness. If you find value in this work, in our commitment to unearthing these difficult truths, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who isn't afraid to look into the shadows. Subscribing ensures you won't miss the conclusion of this story and helps our community of truth seekers grow. Your support is the light that allows us to continue our work. Elodie's plan for escape was a long and patient game, a tapestry woven from stolen moments and carefully observed details. She learned that Silas Rathmore, for all his brutish control, had a predictable weakness: vanity. He believed his system was flawless, his guards incorruptible, his prisoners thoroughly broken. This arrogance created blind spots. Elodie noticed that the laundry carts, filled with soiled linens from the main house and the infirmary, were among the few things that passed through the main gate on a regular schedule without a rigorous inspection. They were pushed by trusted residents to a washing facility located just outside the main wall, a concession made years ago due to the fire risk of the industrial boilers. This was her way out, but she could not simply hide in a cart. The guards at the gate, while lazy, were not fools. She needed a distraction, a significant one, something that would draw all eyes, especially Silas's, away from the gate at the precise moment the cart was scheduled to leave. The plan she conceived was terrifying in its audacity. It would require her to risk everything, to walk directly into the lion's den. She would use the Rathmores' own system against them. She began to intentionally exhibit the very traits that Dr. Eleanor cataloged as signs of contagion. She became sullen. She feigned hearing voices. She whispered nonsense to herself in the laundry. She slowly, deliberately, painted herself as a candidate for the West Ward. Her aim was to get inside, to see what was truly happening there, and to use the ensuing chaos of her own transfer as the diversion she needed. It was a gamble that she was likely to lose, but it was the only one she had. Her performance was convincing. After 2 weeks of escalating instability, she was flagged by an overseer. She was brought before Dr. Eleanor for a final assessment. The interview took place not in an office, but in Eleanor's laboratory, a place no ordinary resident ever saw. The room was a sterile, terrifying fusion of medicine and industry. Gleaming surgical tools were laid out on steel trays next to complex glass beakers and humming electrical apparatuses. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic ozone and another, sweeter, sickeningly metallic odor. Eleanor showed no emotion. She consulted her ledger, her pen tapping rhythmically on the page. "Subject 117, Elodie," she said, her voice flat. "Your file indicates a promising start, a period of compliance. But it seems the taint was merely dormant. The contagion has manifested. A shame." She made a final notation in her book. Prognosis incurable. Transfer to the West Ward for purgative therapy. Purgative therapy. The phrase hung in the sterile air, devoid of any meaning connected to healing. As she was led away by two guards, Elodie caught a glimpse of something that would haunt her forever. Through a connecting door, she saw a room with a large, metal table fitted with leather restraints. And, on a nearby shelf, a row of glass jars containing specimens. They were organs, preserved in formaldehyde, each with a small, numbered tag. Elodie realized with a wave of cold nausea that these were not anatomical models. These were trophies. This was the final destination of the incurables. The West Ward was a living nightmare, a place where all pretense of sanctuary was gone. It was a human vivisection lab. Dr. Eleanor Rathmore, the celebrated physician and progressive scientist, was using the unfit population of Blackwood Reach to conduct horrific medical experiments. Driven by her eugenicist obsession with isolating the physical source of spiritual impurities, she was performing exploratory surgeries on living patients, often without anesthesia. She was testing experimental drugs, toxins, and psychological torments, all in the name of her research. Her detailed notes, which would later become the bedrock of the case against her, documented every grotesque procedure with chilling, scientific detachment. Subject 192, one entry reads, admitted for chronic melancholy. Conducted exploratory craniotomy to examine the pineal gland, which I hypothesize to be the seat of spiritual malaise. Subject expired on the table. Gland harvested for further study. The vessel was weak, but the data is invaluable. Father Alastair was not ignorant of this. He was its architect. He provided the theological justification. In his private writings, he argued that the body was merely a temporary vessel, and that for the truly impure, their physical suffering was a holy act, a purgative therapy that burned away the stain on their soul, even if it destroyed the body in the process. He would often visit the West Ward, not to offer comfort, but to watch. His presence, he claimed, sanctified Eleanor's work, transforming her butchery into a sacred rite. Silas, in turn, managed the grim logistics. He was the one who selected the subjects, who oversaw the guards who strapped them to the tables, and who managed the final, terrible task, the disposal of the bodies. Beneath the West Ward was a specially constructed, high-temperature incinerator. For years, the Rathmores had burned their victims, their ashes simply scattered into the swamp. It was a perfect, smokeless crime. But as the purification accelerated, the number of victims grew. The incinerator could not keep up with the pace of Eleanor's work. Silas, ever the pragmatist, found a simpler solution. He began burying the bodies in the soft, acidic soil of the cypress grove just beyond the western wall, a place he knew would be left undisturbed. He was creating the field of unmarked graves that would one day cry out for justice. Elodie's transfer to the West Ward was her diversion. On the appointed day, as she was being marched across the main courtyard, she enacted the final part of her plan. She screamed. It was not a scream of fear, but a calculated shriek of feigned madness, filled with the blasphemous, nonsensical phrases she had practiced in her mind. Then, she dropped to the ground, convulsing violently. The effect was immediate. It was a shocking disruption to the oppressive order of the Reach. Guards ran towards her. Residents, startled from their work, stopped and stared. And just as she had hoped, Silas Rathmore himself emerged from his office, his face a mask of thunderous rage at this public display of defiance. All eyes were on her. In that moment of manufactured chaos, 100 yards away, the laundry cart, pushed by a sympathetic elderly woman to whom Elodie had entrusted the last of her scavenged food, trundled towards the gate. The guards, their attention diverted by the commotion in the courtyard, waved it through with only a cursory glance. Hidden inside, beneath a pile of foul-smelling linens stained with iodine and blood, Elodie lay perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cart cleared the gate. The heavy iron door boomed shut behind it. She was out, but she was not free. She was alone, in her thin uniform, in the vast, hostile wilderness of the Louisiana swamp, with a truth so monstrous that no one would ever believe her. The moments after her escape were a blur of terror and adrenaline. Elodie crawled from the stifling confinement of the laundry cart, her body aching, her senses overwhelmed by the raw, primal world outside the walls of Blackwood Reach. The air, thick with the scent of decay and teeming life, was a stark contrast to the sterile, chemical stench of her prison. The sounds of the swamp, the drone of insects, the guttural croak of a hidden bullfrog, the distant cry of a marsh bird, were both a symphony of freedom and a chorus of threats. She knew she could not follow the road. Silas would have search parties out within the hour, and they would expect her to take the most direct route to civilization. Her only hope lay in moving through the swamp itself, the very wilderness that had served as the Reach's most effective wall. She plunged into the treeline, the cypress knees and tangled roots grabbing at her ankles. The ground beneath her feet was a treacherous soup of mud and stagnant water. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat, every splash in the water nearby signaling the presence of an alligator or a venomous cottonmouth snake. She was a ghost in a hostile world, armed with nothing but a horrifying secret and a desperate will to survive. For 2 days, she moved parallel to the coast, surviving on nothing but swamp water that she knew was unsafe and the raw, unblinking fear that drove her forward. Her thin uniform was shredded, her skin covered in scratches and insect bites. She was haunted by the faces of the lost, by the memory of the numbered jars in Eleanor's lab, by the chilling echo of Father Alistair's sanctimonious justifications. The truth she carried was a heavy, poisonous burden. If she died out here, the story of Blackwood Reach died with her. On the 3rd day, delirious with hunger and fever, she stumbled upon a small, isolated camp of Cajun trappers. They were wary, accustomed to a life of solitude and distrustful of outsiders, especially one who appeared so wild and distressed. But they were also a people with a long history of being marginalized, and they saw in Elodie's terrified eyes a desperation that transcended their suspicion. An elderly woman in the camp, a matriarch named Celestine, took her in. She did not press for details, but cleaned her wounds, gave her food, and let her sleep. It was in this small, stilted shack, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and drying pelts, that Elodie finally broke her silence. She told her story. At first, her rescuers listened with skepticism. The Rathmores were known in the region as powerful, wealthy benefactors. The idea that their Christian sanctuary was a house of slaughter seemed like the ravings of a disturbed mind. But Elodie had one piece of proof that they could not dismiss: the coated hem of her uniform. She painstakingly explained the meaning of the pinpricks, pointing to one cluster after another. "This was Anya," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "This was a boy named Leo, taken from the workshop. This was a woman who refused Father Alistair." The trappers, who lived by the tangible evidence of the natural world, saw the truth in the grim, meticulous record-keeping. The secret language of the needle transformed her from a mad woman into a credible witness. Celestine, the matriarch, knew they could not go to the local sheriff. He was a regular guest at the Rathmore Sunday dinners, his palms greased with their seemingly endless supply of money. The system was insulated, protected. They needed to go to someone outside the sphere of the Rathmore's influence, someone the family could not intimidate or bribe. Celestine had a nephew, a young, ambitious journalist working for a newspaper in New Orleans, a man known for his tenacity and his interest in stories of corruption. His name was Thomas Gagnon, and he would become the champion of Elodie's story, the uncoverer of truth who would take her whispered testimony and forge it into a weapon. The journey to New Orleans was fraught with peril. Silas's men were still searching, and the Rathmores had put out the story that a dangerously insane patient had escaped and was a threat to the public. Thomas Gagnon met his aunt and the strange, haunted woman accompanying her in a dimly lit cafe in the French Quarter. He was a professional skeptic, his career built on distinguishing fact from fabrication. He listened to Elodie's story for hours, his expression shifting from disbelief to intrigue, and finally to a cold, professional fury. The details were too specific, too internally consistent to be invented. The story of the numbered jars, the purgative therapy, the secret incinerator, and the field of graves. It was monstrous, but it had the chilling ring of truth. Gagnon knew that the testimony of one escaped lunatic, as the Rathmores would surely brand her, was not enough. He needed corroboration. He needed to break through the walls of Blackwood Reach. He began his investigation with the one thing he could track: money. He delved into the Rathmores' financial dealings, uncovering a complex web of shell corporations and charitable fronts that funneled money from their wealthy northern donors into accounts used for suspicious purchases. He found requisitions for industrial incinerators, massive orders of surgical equipment sent to a remote post office box, and payments to chemical companies for ether, chloroform, and formaldehyde in quantities that far exceeded the needs of any legitimate infirmary. While Gagnon built his financial case, he also began searching for other voices, other victims. He spent weeks in the poorest districts of New Orleans and New York, tracking down the families of people who had been sent to Blackwood Reach. He found a recurring pattern. A family would commit a troublesome relative, receive a few glowing progress reports, and then silence. When they inquired further, they were told their loved one had been transferred or had passed away peacefully. The stories were all heartbreakingly similar, a chorus of quiet grief and unanswered questions. Gagnon had found the echoes of the lost. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gagnon located a disgruntled former guard from the Reach, a man who had been fired by Silas for drunkenness. The man was terrified, but his guilt and his hatred for Silas were stronger than his fear. He agreed to speak on the condition of absolute anonymity. He confirmed the existence of the West Ward. He described seeing residents being led into Dr. Eleanor's laboratory and never coming out. He couldn't provide details of what happened inside, but he gave Gagnon something even more valuable: a hand-drawn map of the compound, including the location of the West Ward, Silas's office, and a notation for a soft spot in the western wall where the mortar was crumbling, near a large cypress grove. Gagnon now had a witness, financial evidence, and a map. He published his first story, a carefully worded expose that did not print the most lurid details of Elodie's testimony, but laid out a damning case of financial fraud and suspicious disappearances connected to the Rathmore institution. The article was an earthquake. It sent shockwaves through the philanthropic community in the North and caused a political firestorm in Louisiana. The Rathmores, for the first time, were on the defensive. Father Alastair issued a furious public denial, branding the story a slanderous attack by a yellow journalist and a delusional runaway. He portrayed himself and his family as the victims, their Christian charity repaid with vicious lies. But Gagnon's article had done its job. It had raised enough questions to force the hand of the state authorities. Under immense public pressure, the governor authorized a formal investigation, a state commission to visit the Blackwood Reach and ascertain the truth. The Rathmores, confident in their ability to control what the investigators would see, agreed to the visit. They began a frantic, systematic cover-up, a desperate attempt to scrub the blood from the walls before the world came knocking. The announcement of the state investigation sent the Rathmore siblings into a controlled frenzy. Their fortress, which for years had been impenetrable to outside scrutiny, was about to be breached. For Father Alastair, this was a public relations war. He immediately launched a counteroffensive in the press, painting Thomas Gagnon as a purveyor of morbid fantasies and Elodie as a hysterical ingrate. He wrote eloquent, impassioned letters to his donors, assuring them that the investigation was a mere formality, a political nuisance that would ultimately vindicate their noble work. The forces of ignorance and malice have ever sought to tear down the works of the righteous, he wrote in an open letter published in a Boston newspaper. But the light of our purpose cannot be extinguished by the foul breath of slander. We welcome this inquiry, for the truth is our staunchest ally. His performance was, as always, magnificent. He projected an aura of wounded dignity and unwavering faith, and many of his supporters rallied to his cause, denouncing the investigation as a witch hunt. But behind the scenes, a desperate and meticulous cleansing was underway, orchestrated by the other 2 points of the Trinity. Dr. Eleanor Rathmore, the methodical specialist, was tasked with sanitizing her laboratory of horrors. For days, the smoke from the West Ward's incinerator, usually reserved for the disposal of human remains, billowed thick and dark as she burned years of accumulated evidence. Her most incriminating research notes, the detailed logs of her vivisections and torturous experiments, were the first to be consumed by the flames. She personally supervised the destruction of her specimen collection, the numbered jars containing the organs of her victims. They were smashed, and their contents were burned or dissolved in acid. Her laboratory, once a theater of ghoulish science, was stripped and scrubbed until it resembled the simple, benign infirmary described in their pamphlets. The surgical tables were replaced with ordinary cots, the complex electrical devices were hidden in secret cellars, and the entire West Ward was repainted in a cheerful, calming shade of white. It was a transformation of monstrous efficiency. Eleanor, with her precise and detached mind, understood that the absence of evidence was its own form of proof. She was erasing the crime from the physical world. While Eleanor sanitized the past, Silas, the practical enforcer, managed the present. His primary task was to control the living evidence, the residents. He knew that even with the most severe intimidation, some might be brave or foolish enough to speak to the investigators. His solution was brutal and direct. He identified nearly 24 residents, men and women he considered high risk, those who had shown defiance, those who were too aware, those who had been close to someone who had disappeared. These individuals were rounded up in the middle of the night. They were not taken to the West Ward, which was now being prepared for public viewing. They were marched out to the far northern edge of the property, to a series of old, abandoned indigo vats left over from the plantation era. There they were systematically executed, their bodies dumped into the deep, brick-lined pits. Silas then ordered the vats to be flooded with water from the swamp and covered with heavy wooden lids, hoping the bodies would decompose quickly in the murky water, hidden from view. It was a final, desperate massacre designed to silence the last remaining voices of dissent before the inspectors arrived. The rest of the residents were subjected to an intense campaign of psychological terror. Silas and his guards reminded them, in no uncertain terms, of the price of speaking out of turn. Father Alastair, his mask of benevolence firmly back in place, held a series of special sermons, his words now laced with subtle but unmistakable threats. He spoke of the sin of bearing false witness and the divine retribution that awaited those who betrayed their saviors. By the time the State Commission steamboat was seen chugging up the bayou, Blackwood Reach was a Potemkin village of piety and order. The residents were clean, well-fed, and utterly, convincingly terrified into silence. The investigation was a carefully choreographed piece of theater. The commission, composed of 3 state senators, a physician, and a clergyman, were personally greeted by Father Alastair. He was charm personified, leading them on a guided tour of the facility. They saw the gleaming kitchens, the orderly dormitories, the productive workshops, and the peaceful chapel. They were shown the infirmary in the West Ward, now an immaculate, empty space that Dr. Eleanor explained was for patients needing quiet convalescence. When the commissioners attempted to speak to residents, they were met with downcast eyes and mumbled, rehearsed answers. The fear that Silas had instilled in them was so palpable it was mistaken for discipline and respect. The commission's physician inspected Eleanor's sanitized lab and her forged medical logs, which now showed a history of common illnesses and natural deaths. He found nothing out of the ordinary. The investigation was on the verge of becoming a complete whitewash, a total victory for the Rathmores. But Thomas Gagnon had not been idle. He had anticipated the cover-up. Through his anonymous source, the former guard, he knew that the Rathmores' control was not absolute, and he still had his star witness, Elodie, hidden away and safe. On the second day of the commission's visit, Gagnon executed a brilliant and daring maneuver. He hired a private boat and, using the guard's hand-drawn map, bypassed the main dock and landed on a secluded stretch of shoreline on the western edge of the property, far from the official tour. He was accompanied by 2 people, a trusted photographer from his newspaper and a federal marshal from New Orleans, whom he had convinced, through sheer force of will and the presentation of his financial evidence, to accompany them as an impartial observer. Their destination was the cypress grove that the former guard had marked on his map. As they pushed through the dense, swampy undergrowth, the air grew heavy and still. The ground became soft, uneven. And then they saw it. A wide, open area where the earth was disturbed, marked by a series of shallow, rectangular depressions. It was the field of unmarked graves. It was exactly where the guard had said it would be. Using shovels they had brought with them, Gagnon and the marshal began to dig. It did not take long. Less than 2 feet down, their shovels struck something solid. They cleared the dark, peaty soil away and uncovered the decomposing remains of a human body, wrapped in a simple burlap sack. The photographer's flashbulb popped, its brilliant, artificial light a stark violation of the grove's long-held secret. They had found the physical proof. At that very moment, as the commission was enjoying a lavish lunch with Father Alastair, Gagnon sent the federal marshal walking calmly up to the main house. The marshal entered the dining hall, his face grim, his boots muddy. He approached the head of the commission and in a quiet, formal voice that cut through the polite chatter, informed him that a mass grave had been discovered on the property. The effect was cataclysmic. Alastair's face, for the first time, lost its composure, his mask of piety shattering into a million pieces. Dr. Eleanor froze, a wine glass halfway to her lips. Silas, seated at the far end of the table, instinctively stood up, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. The charade was over. The truth unearthed from the mud and decay of the cypress grove had finally breached the walls of Blackwood Reach. The investigation had become a criminal excavation. The discovery of the mass grave shattered the carefully constructed reality of Blackwood Reach. The State Commission, which had been moments away from declaring the Rathmores institution a model of modern charity, was now standing at the edge of a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The facade of order and piety collapsed instantly, replaced by the grim mechanics of a massive criminal investigation. Thomas Gagnon's gamble had paid off spectacularly. The presence of the federal marshal lent official gravity to his discovery, preventing Silas's guards from interfering and forcing the state commissioners to confront a truth they could no longer ignore. The initial shock in the dining hall gave way to a swift and decisive shift in power. The investigators became prosecutors. The hosts became prisoners in their own fortress. Father Alastair, for the first time in his life, was speechless. His charismatic authority evaporated, leaving behind a pale, trembling man. Dr. Eleanor retreated into a shell of cold, clinical silence, her expression unreadable. Silas, ever the pragmatist, seemed to understand their position was hopeless. His instinct was not to talk, but to fight or flee, and both options were now impossible. The 3 Rathmore siblings were immediately separated and placed under guard in their own rooms. The entire compound was sealed, not to keep residents in, but to keep the evidence from being further disturbed. The state officials, now acting with the urgency they had previously lacked, telegraphed a request for reinforcements. Within 24 hours, Blackwood Reach was swarming with state police and forensic specialists from New Orleans, a city all too familiar with the specter of death, but rarely on this industrial scale. The excavation of the cypress grove began in earnest. It was a slow, agonizing process. The humid Louisiana heat was oppressive, and the work was both physically and emotionally grueling. Each shallow grave yielded a new horror. The bodies, in various states of decomposition, were exhumed one by one. Many were found in simple burlap sacks, while others had been buried with no covering at all. The forensic team, led by a hardened New Orleans coroner, quickly began to piece together the story written in the bones. They found evidence of extreme malnutrition, of untreated diseases, but also of something far more sinister. They discovered fractured skulls, broken limbs that had healed badly or not at all, and strange surgical scars. The climactic reveal of the true horror was not a single moment, but a series of cascading revelations, each more damning than the last. The first major break came when the investigators, armed with the new, absolute authority of their search warrant, broke down the door to the secret cellar beneath Dr. Eleanor's laboratory. There, hidden behind a false wall, they found the items she had not had time to destroy. They found her secondary set of ledgers, the ones detailing her purgative therapies. These were not medical notes, they were the diaries of a monster. Written in her precise, elegant script were detailed accounts of her experiments. She had documented her attempts to remove sections of the brain to cure defiance, her injections of untested chemical compounds to observe their effects on the human nervous system, and her vivisections performed on conscious patients to study the physical manifestations of fear and pain. Thomas Gagnon, who was granted access to the documents, described them later as a roadmap to a landscape of human suffering so vast and so cold that it defies the descriptive power of language. The ledgers contained the names, or rather the numbers, of her victims and the dates of their deaths. When cross-referenced with the bodies being exhumed from the grove, the matches were undeniable. The second shoe to drop was the discovery of the indigo vats, acting on a tip from one of the residents who, now feeling safe for the first time, finally found the courage to speak. Investigators drained the fetid water from the old plantation structures. They found the tangled remains of the last victims, the 24 souls Silas had executed in the final days to silence them. The cause of death here was not surgical butchery, but brutal, simple murder. The evidence pointed directly to Silas, the enforcer who had carried out the final bloody purge. But the most chilling discovery, the one that truly captured the heart of the Rathmores' macabre philosophy, was found in Father Alastair's private study. Behind a sliding panel in his library, investigators found his personal journals. These were not the writings of a simple con man or a greedy fraud. They were the theological and philosophical justification for the entire enterprise. Alastair wrote in soaring, eloquent prose about his belief that he and his siblings were agents of a divine purification. He argued that certain souls were irredeemably stained, and that their physical bodies were mere prisons for this spiritual contagion. In his view, the suffering and death they inflicted at Blackwood Reach was not murder. It was a holy, albeit painful, act of spiritual hygiene. He wrote, "We are not jailers, but gardeners. We do not punish, but prune. It is a terrible and lonely burden to see the blight upon the vine so clearly and to be tasked by God himself to cut away, lest the entire vineyard be lost. History may not understand our methods, but heaven will approve our results." In his own words, Father Alastair provided the motive, the ideology that fueled the entire machine. It was not about money, not really. It was about a grandiose, narcissistic, and homicidal vision of their own divinity. With the ledgers, the bodies, and the journals, the state had an ironclad case. The trial of the Rathmore siblings was a national sensation. Thomas Gagnon's articles provided a running commentary, and Elodie, now hailed as a heroine, was the star witness. Her testimony was riveting. She spoke with a quiet, unshakable dignity, her voice never faltering, as she recounted the horrors she had witnessed. She identified the personal effects that had been found, putting names and faces to the numbered victims. She described the sounds from the West Ward, the lies of Father Alastair, the brutality of Silas, and the cold, dead eyes of Dr. Eleanor. She presented the coated hem of her uniform as evidence, a humble, powerful symbol of her resistance. On the stand, the Rathmores reacted in ways that were perfectly consistent with their characters. Father Alastair delivered a long, rambling sermon from the witness box, a defiant, self-pitying tirade in which he cast himself as a martyr persecuted by a godless world. Dr. Eleanor remained silent, detached, and observant, as if the trial itself were merely one more interesting, if unpleasant, experiment. Silas was sullen and violent, at one point attempting to charge the prosecution table before being restrained. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict them on hundreds of counts of murder, torture, and unlawful imprisonment. The judge, in his sentencing, called their crimes an affront not only to the laws of man, but to the very concept of a benevolent God. Father Alastair and Silas Rathmore were sentenced to death by hanging. Dr. Eleanor Rathmore, due to her gender, was spared the gallows, but was sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security asylum, a place from which she would never emerge. The reign of the Rathmores was over. The gates of Blackwood Reach were thrown open, and its surviving residents, ghosts returning to a world that had forgotten them, were finally free. The aftermath of the Rathmore trial was long and complicated, a somber epilogue to a story of profound darkness. The verdict brought a sense of legal closure, but the deep wounds inflicted by the Blackwood Reach experiment could not be so easily healed. The nation was left to grapple with a series of unsettling questions about the nature of faith, the authority of science, and the vulnerability of those who live on the margins of society. The immediate fate of Blackwood Reach itself was a subject of intense debate. For a time, the state considered repurposing the facility, transforming it into a genuine hospital or orphanage as a way of reclaiming its history. But the stain of the Rathmores' crimes was too deep, the psychic residue of the suffering too palpable. The buildings were seen not as structures of brick and mortar, but as monuments to an atrocity. In the end, it was decided that the main compound, including the West Ward and Father Alastair's chapel, should be razed to the ground. The demolition was a public spectacle, drawing crowds who watched in silence as the walls of the fortress came crumbling down. Only the field of graves and the old indigo vats were left untouched, consecrated as a permanent memorial to the victims. Today, the site is a quiet, mournful place, looked after by a state historical trust. A single large granite monument stands at the edge of the cypress grove, engraved with the 347 names that were recovered through the painstaking work of Thomas Gagnon and the subsequent investigation. For the survivors, the path forward was fraught with difficulty. They walked out of the gates of Blackwood Reach as free individuals, but they were deeply scarred, not just by the physical abuse, but by the psychological torment they had endured. They had been systematically dehumanized, stripped of their names and identities, and taught to believe in their own worthlessness. Re-entering a world that had cast them out once before was a daunting challenge. Many had no families to return to. They struggled with trauma, with poverty, and with the social stigma of having been inmates of what was now universally known as a murder farm. Elodie, the quiet hero of the story, dedicated her life to helping them. Using a portion of the reward money she received from the state and funds from a charitable trust established in the victims' names, she founded a halfway house in New Orleans. It was a place of refuge and recovery, a safe haven where the survivors of Blackwood Reach could begin to rebuild their lives. She never married, never had children of her own. The residents of her shelter became her family. She remained a private person, shunning the fame that her role in the case had brought her, and passed away peacefully in the 1950s, remembered by those she helped as a saint of the broken. Thomas Gagnon's career was launched into the stratosphere by his exposé. He became one of the most respected investigative journalists of his generation, his name synonymous with the relentless pursuit of truth. Yet, the Rathmore case haunted him for the rest of his life. In his memoirs, written shortly before his death, he reflected on the profound evil he had uncovered. "I have spent a lifetime exposing the corrupt and the cruel," he wrote, but the Rathmores were unique. They were not driven by simple greed or political ambition. They were driven by an idea, a philosophy of perfection that required the systematic destruction of the imperfect. It is a chilling reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often not those who crawl from the abyss, but those who seek to build a heaven on earth, using the bodies of others as their foundation. The fates of the Rathmores themselves played. The scaffold. He spoke of his own martyrdom, of the great work he had done, and of the ungrateful world that had condemned him. The executioner, unmoved by the performance, cut him off mid-sentence. His death was a quiet, ignominious end for a man whose voice had once commanded thousands. Dr. Eleanor Rathmore lived for another 30 years, confined to the state asylum for the criminally insane. She never spoke a word about Blackwood Reach. She spent her days in the asylum's library, reading medical textbooks and scientific journals. She filled dozens of notebooks with her elegant, precise script, but when they were examined after her death, they contained nothing but complex mathematical equations and chemical formulas. She had retreated completely into the cold, ordered world of abstract science, leaving the chaotic, messy world of human suffering far behind. The legacy of the Rathmores serves as a dark and enduring cautionary tale. It stands as a testament to the dangers of unchecked power, especially when that power is cloaked in the righteous language of faith and progress. They exploited a system that was designed to care for the vulnerable, twisting its purpose to serve their own monstrous ideology. Their story forces us to look at the shadows that often accompany periods of great social change, to question the motives of charismatic leaders who promise utopia, and to remember that the veneer of civilization can sometimes be terrifyingly thin. The unmarked graves at Blackwood Reach are a permanent reminder that the blighted branches Dr. Eleanor wrote of were not abstract concepts. They were people, each with a story, a hope, and a life that was stolen from them. They were the victims of a family who believed they had the right to decide who was worthy of life, a family who never burned their witches, but who, in the name of purification, created a hell on earth that was far more real and far more terrible than any superstitious fantasy. The silence that now hangs over the ruins of Blackwood Reach is a heavy one, filled with the ghosts of the lost. But it is a silence that also speaks, a warning that echoes down through the decades, that the most profound evil often wears the mask of virtue, and that we must never, ever turn away from the stories of the forgotten. What is the line between radical belief and criminal insanity? How do charismatic leaders convince their followers to abandon their own morality? These are not just historical questions. They are deeply relevant today. The story of the Rathmores is a dark mirror, reflecting a potential for cruelty that lies dormant not just in the past, but in the present as well. We must remain vigilant. We must continue to ask the hard questions and to shine a light into the forgotten corners of our world. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, then our work has been successful. We ask you one last time to join our mission. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a future investigation, and share this story with others. Let the memory of the victims of Blackwood Reach serve as a catalyst for awareness and a shield against the darkness. Thank you for being a part of this journey.